What are antique mantle clocks? Antique mantle clocks make on a mantle or shelf. They may be complex or simple. However, if they reserve under proper care, their value will often increase over the years. Even though they may come from a ramification of locations and eras, clocks are more than a century old and commonly appear as antiques. History of antique mantle clock. French craftsmen created the primary mantle clock in the mid-18th century. Their call comes from the fact that they are often placed on mantles above fireplaces. They were developed as an opportunity for a beautiful wall clock. The smaller movements allow the clock to become more compact while retaining the precision of the long pendulums of earlier fashions. France and England produced the most prolific makers of clocks. The maximum complex clock is among the oldest. They are framed in a decorative scroll and decorated with copper or gold. At the beginning of the 19th century, these clocks made their way across the Atlantic and quickly rose in popularity and price. While many American watches from this period resembled their ECU counterparts, they were made of cheaper materials. For example, Seth Thomas watches are simply as attractive as several French watches, but many of them had veneers on the front that gave the impression of being made with greater individuality. Function. French clocks, used for a duration, were changing appearance around the same time. Mantle clocks with collectible figurines began to appear. Earlier clocks often had entire scroll pieces surrounding the dial, while this more modern era regularly included a dial lined with larger figures. Watchmakers began experimenting with new woods and metals as the craft advanced. Antique clocks can also be made from porcelain, brass, ceramic, and wood, although iron is the most common material. Vintage mantle clocks regularly consist of a clock movement that requires winding with a key. The first-class clocks are regularly wound, having been named after their operation. For example, an 8-day clock requires winding every 8 days. These clocks are easy to implement because many hallmarks are key and have wound holes in the clock face. Famous mantle clock manufacturers. Below are some of the popular mantle clock manufacturers. Distinguishing antique mantle clocks. The two forms of clocks are antique and vintage. The vintage mantle clocks went back at least a century. Anything more youthful appears vintage. In addition, old mantle clocks should not be mistaken for used or second-hand gadgets. One of the hallmarks of old clocks is their potential to tell time and chime without the aid of outside forces. They are often coiled and mechanical. In addition, the integrity of its mainspring and the availability of movement located in the back panel set it apart from the competition. This old mantle clock was decorated with jewels, statues, and figures. They were huge, enclosed in solid wood, finished with moldings from time to time, and sealed with a gold label on the back bearing the maker's mark. In addition, the elements of this watch are simply a tool for relaxation. It suggests that watch authenticity is defined by the rarity of its ingredients and the requirement for professional maintenance. Carriage, atmospheric, tower, tambour, torsion, skeleton, and decorative clocks are some of the most popular styles of antique clocks. Types of antique mantle clocks. Understanding the many types of antique clocks will help you perceive them quickly. They created unique designs before manufacturers began to write their signatures on their wares. You will now be able to comprehend the logo by looking at the layout, just like seasoned lenders can. Ansonia. In the mid-1800s and early 1900s, these antique clocks turned into creatures. One of the few agencies that made porcelain frames turned into Ansonia. They can be expensive because it's hard to come back to using them. Bracket. The hours on this 17th-century French antique clock are housed in a rectangular case. This layout is supposed to be in various iterations along with Atmos and torsion. Atmos. The time displays via temperature adjustments in this Swiss layout. It contains a sealed pill, the interior of which is a mixture of gases that reacts to temperature adjustments. Torsion. This clock has a pendulum that swings from side to side depending on the pressure applied. Steeple. The steeple is a clock from the 19th century with a Gothic design. It resembles a church steeple, resulting in an unusual call. Skeleton. This vintage mantle clock is a skeleton without a framed case. The dial mechanisms are visible in the open. Timbre. British men created this vintage mantle clock in the 20th century. It has a long base and an upright drum with a round face. Close your eyes and imagine the O of the ohm signal with the clock base sitting on the mantelpiece. Art décor. The geometric patterns of the art clocks are French and Swiss. The period of their production ranged from the 30s to the 60s. However, its identification is not easy among the antiquities, as they have not yet reached 100. Maybe in 10 years, we will think about them. Identifying antique mantle clocks. When evaluating a vintage mantle clock, you need to focus on the following 3 factors: style, manufacturer, and materials. Antique mantle clocks. Materials. Fabrics give away manufacturing time like hotcakes. You can tell if an item is dubbed by carefully examining the content. Using the material as a base recognition of your evaluation is easy when working with old clocks. Materials used by watchmakers from the 17th century to the 20th century are listed chronologically. Wood. American designs include vintage mantle clocks with thick wooden cases. Between 1880 and 1931, Terry used wood with black enamel. The affordable material had a smooth texture to a shine. Between 1820 and 1905, American watchmakers used mahogany, cherry, and oak for their cases. In 1905, they changed to plywood. Porcelain. Advances in the early 20th century brought an upward trend to antique porcelain clocks. They are luxurious due to their rarity and fragility. Stone. A massive antique clock with a stone case lacked handles due to its weight. Since this arrangement was eternal, it served mainly as a decoration. Onyx, marble, and slate were among the materials used with the help of French watchmakers. Metal. Metal is a 20th century material used in mantle clocks. It has a traditional American vintage look. Remember the fact that the most effective items courting the lower back 100 years or more are considered antiques. Antiquarians are over 50 years old but under 100 years old. Plastic. Plastic mantle clocks were more popular during the 1930s and 1990s. Manufacturers created their case using bakelite, Caitlin, and adamantine. Be careful as the finish on adamantine can mimic slate, onyx, or marble. Style. Did you realize that manufacture year can find on antique mantle clocks? Right, only American designs since those were the ones that started mass production. In 1896, because of this incident, watchmakers gave their creations a country stamp. It turned into beneficial for identification then and now. Please note, clocks made before 1896 do not have kingdom marks. Writing anniversary dates on labels has another American way of life, much like manufacturing dates. Old clocks have a different date strategy. They write the years backward and indicate the months with the letters AL. Since A means January, B means February, and so on until L is December, January 1793 could be 3971A. If your old Roman clock shows any electroplating feature, you must be able to identify the year it was made, as the most skillful method became popular after 1836. Movement. The clock mechanism is called a movement in old clocks. Antique clocks have quartz movement, while antique clocks equip with mechanical movements. They require regular winding with a key, unlike today's battery-operated options. Most old clocks have 8-day winds, which means you have to wind them once every 8 days. There are also 14-day and 31-day versions, but they are more expensive due to their scarcity. Use the control rectangle and dial to find the date. Post-1901 models read below the center of the dial, while pre-1901 clocks have +12 readings. It is because those made after 1901 are 89 models. Traditional mantle clocks value guide. The last exercise in your training is determining when to raise your bid or fold. Depending on characteristics, clocks can sell for $100 to $10,000. When trying to determine if a mantle clock is antique or not, there are a few elements to notice. The materials. Examine the materials first. Commonly mantle clocks were made of porcelain, steel, or wood. Now your clock may not be vintage. But a modern imitation of Miles makes of plastic or steel. The face. The face of the clock is any other indicator that this is a vintage mantle clock. The dial of a vintage watch is usually made of porcelain, tooth, or steel. Unlike publication, letters and numbers should be carved or painted. The label. Then, look for the label or manufacturer's mark. Many manufacturers have printed their name or logo on the bottom of the watch. If you record the call, do a little research to determine the organization's founding date. Evaluating an antique clock value. Age. Start by considering the age of the watch. The cost of lessons will increase with age. A clock industrially produced in the 18th century may be worth more than a clock developed in the 19th century. Note, clocks should be at least 100 years old to qualify as vintage. Materials. Next, think about the material. Porcelain or brass clocks can cost more than wooden clocks. Next, think about the material. Porcelain or brass clocks can cost more than wooden clocks. Condition. Compare the kingdom of hours. Is it functionally okay? Does it require a refresh? Your watch can become more precious the better it is maintained. Compare the kingdom of hours. Is it functionally okay? Does it require a refresh? Your watch can become more precious the better it is maintained. Rarity. Finally, think about how unusual the watch is. Watches can be much cheaper than extra high-priced watches. Remember that the fee for antique clocks is not always fixed. The financial system and the prevailing popularity of antique watches are the best examples of variables that can motivate trade. If you are looking for a standard rate, you can assume that most antique clocks will be worth between $50 and $300. Considered one of the few expensive and rare examples, a French ormolu clock in the fashion of Louis XVI can fetch thousands of euros. If you are considering selling a watch, it is usually a great idea to contact a professional to get the most accurate appraisal possible. In case you are considering buying, we recommend that you get in touch with a genuine seller to ensure exact rates. How to buy old-fashioned mantle clocks. Through online and offline methods, anyone can discover antique clocks. The many factors at play make the buying process extremely unique. Offline purchases are usually expensive and require a little more effort. Contrary, if you don't mind shelling out the extra cash to get a proper vintage mantle clock, online purchases are incredible. In the real world, there are 3 basic ways to buy an aged mantle clock. Auction houses. Auction houses are a useful resource for finding antique watches, but you need to be aware that they don't regularly give refunds now. As a result, you can be stuck after buying clocks that appear fake or broken. If you decide to buy from a personal dealer, we recommend that you bring along an expert to help you analyze the watch. This way, you can be sure that the antique clock you are buying is genuine and no longer a reproduction. Online shopping. eBay, one of the largest online marketplaces in the world, is the primary place to buy vintage mantle clocks online. You can find almost anything on eBay, including vintage mantle clocks like this one. Etsy is a fantastic resource for finding handmade and antique items. Since the general public associates Etsy with arts and crafts, it can be hard to discover antiques there. But if you look hard enough, you might come across some real gems. Love Antiques is a website dedicated to antiques. You can be sure that each of the many old clock options is authentic. Facts. Do antique clocks beneficial? Yes, antique clocks prove very beneficial. For example, you can sell to the government for keeping in the museum worth more than $750. In addition, you can also keep them at your beauty for enhancing the beauty of your house. What is the process of identification for an antique clock? You can identify it through its material. If you have a clock from 1,000 years, it will be considered an antique clock. However, a younger generation of beautiful clocks is known as the vintage clock series. What is the most costly antique clock these days? Duc d'Orléans Breguet Sympathique is considered the most expensive clock. It was developed in the year of 1795. In 1835, it was sold for $6.8 million and grabbed the title of most expensive antique clock. Final thoughts. Antique clocks are the ultimate passion of different people. Selling and buying these antique pieces has become at its peak. If you also want to do this business, it proves profitable for you due to their high prices. On the other hand, you can make a collection of antique pieces at your home. It escalates the aestheticism of your spot and put a unique touch. In this post, we have covered every point about antique mantle clocks. If you want to share anything about this subject matter, please let us know in the comment section. We'll welcome your suggestions.